Hey, Larken Rose here, and with sunlight fading fast here, I'm going to quickly record an update for Patreon. I think I'll stick this on YouTube for the public as well. For those of you who want to support my Patreon, I'll put a link below. I've been doing weekly updates on what I've been working on in the project because it's a gigantic project, and I think people should be able to hear now and then what I've been doing for the people who are actually donating to it. But this one I'll do in public because I might give people an idea of what the heck this thing is, a more specific idea. See if I can do it before it's dark out. Again, it'll be short. So I'll assume you know the basics, that it's an interactive thing where it walks somebody through a series of questions, and how they answer each question determines where they go next and all that. I'm going to give you the 8 general chunks of what it goes through in this process, because it's broken down to it's a flow chart that every question depends on what their prior answer was, so they determine where it goes. But there are main chunks that everything goes through. The first one is to get the person's view on the general nature of morality. First of all, if they believe in right and wrong at all. And it doesn't matter how they define it or determine it. It doesn't matter if it comes from a religious book or their own conscience or whatever theory or idea. If they believe in right and wrong, that's all that matters. If they don't, it still goes down, for moral nihilists, it goes down a different line of questioning. Most people won't be there, but it goes down a different line of questioning. But because all of it has to do with what should be, how people should treat each other, what the world should look like, what's good and what's bad, it starts with the foundation of getting the person to figure out what or answer some questions about their view on the basis of morality. A number of things are whether they think morality changes from place to place or from time to time, or basically if they think that morality is something objective that we're supposed to figure out, like what people are supposed to do, or if it's just whatever the culture thinks at that time is right and wrong. And again, it doesn't matter which one of them they choose. Either way, it continues down the road with the questions and gets them to it. It doesn't try to talk them into one side or the other, but it needs to figure out exactly what they believe about morality. So the first chunk has to do with time and place, whether that has an effect on morality. Scale, whether they think it's bad for one person to do this, but if a bunch of people or the majority does it, then it's okay. If they think opinions actually determine morality. Like the difference between, my opinion about math doesn't change how math actually functions. My opinion is either right or wrong, but math is math. And does the person going through it view morality that way, or do they think it's sort of a cumulative total of the opinion of people and cultural influences and stuff? And it gets into the concept of individual rights versus group rights, and is there a difference? Again, the point here is not to talk them into anything, it's just to see which they believe. Does morality apply in all directions? Does it apply to everybody? If it's wrong for you, it's wrong for somebody else? Or do they think it's relative depending on somebody's opinion? Like if somebody thinks it's okay to murder people, is it okay for them to murder somebody or people? And most people, of course, from their perspective would say no. Even if they think it's okay, I still think it's bad. But to begin with, you have to get people looking at the right and wrong and good and bad and should and shouldn't. And it doesn't even matter how they define those terms, as long as they think here's what people should be, here's what people shouldn't be, and how they define that or where they determine it doesn't particularly matter. The first chunk gets a little bit into the concept of delegating morality. Like, if it's bad for you to do, is it okay for you to have somebody else do it for you? And almost everybody instinctively understands, no, that's not okay. And what about numbers? Like, if it's bad for you to do and your neighbor, what if 10 of you want to do something that's bad for all of you? Can that make it okay? Like, at what point does the common good make it okay to do something that would have been universally recognized as bad if you did it yourself? And so that's very brief general view of the first chunk. I have to go faster. I'm going to be doing this in pitch black. So the second chunk is the basics of what they think about morality, what they think about right and wrong and should and shouldn't, and good and bad, and how people think. And one of the main differences is, do you believe in the golden rule, as in treat other people the way you want to be treated, as in morality applies the same to everybody, Or do you think that whatever serves you is okay? And this is something that like moral nihilists will sometimes say, well, if, I happen to not want to murder people, but if I thought it was in my interest to do so, then that's perfectly fine. Like, I don't think it's actually bad. So again, this is just finding out what they believe. And then I intentionally do a thing where I ask them questions to see how far their principles go. At what point would they, even if they think, well, no, individual rights are important, the group doesn't get to force its will. Like, at what point, like the trolley problem, I won't use that exact example because it's everywhere anyway. But the whole thing, what if you could save 1 million people by killing one innocent person, would you? And the point there is just to make people think about it and start to get clear in their own head of what they are. Now, throughout most of this, throughout the first 7, almost all of it, in fact, it's just gathering their opinions and their views on right and wrong and morality and how people should be until it leads up to the way society is now and gets into authority and how that goes against what almost everybody says they believe about how people should be. So this is sort of collecting their view on how we should think about things. And so it gets into the difference between voluntary deals and trades and interactions, and then coercion and fraud, voluntary versus coercion and what counts as consent, things like that. And again, it's still basic questions. It isn't in lecture form. It's not like trying to give them a course in the concepts. It's just asking them what they already think about it. But in the process of doing that, a lot of people who haven't thought about it before have to think about it and go, oh yeah, where is the line between really good advertising and fraud? Like, I saw that commercial and I thought this product was going to do this awesome thing and it totally doesn't. Okay, was that just you reading too much into it, or were they actually lying about it? A lot of times it's supposed to get them to look at that gray area and try to decide, and the point is not to make them decide a certain way. It's to see where they draw the lines and to get them to start to think about it, because when we get up to stuff that matters, then they can think about that and have to, decide where they draw that line when it comes to coercion and authoritarianism and collectivism and all that fun stuff. So number 3 has to do with, the number 3 big chunk of the thing has to do with the use of force. That includes defensive force and aggressive force. It basically, by way of questions, asks them, when do you think it's okay to use force? And some people will say, well, never. Well, what if somebody's attacking you? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, then to defend yourself, it's justified and that's okay. So it's to get them to think about when is force actually justified, and things like proportionality, which it's not going to use that word because most people don't know what the heck proportionality means. But like, if somebody steals a nickel from you and you blow his head off, is that justified? And most people are going to go, no, we can't have that. That's ridiculous. And even just defining force, like what counts as force, and the difference between force and threats of force. Like, if it's not okay to actually beat somebody up and take their stuff, is it okay to threaten them? Say, I'm going to beat you up if you don't give me your stuff. And most people will go, well, no, that's not okay either, even though you didn't actually physically assault them. So again, a lot of this is just to try to get people to think in areas and think about subjects that they haven't usually thought about before. And the concept of using force for somebody's own force against somebody for their own good, with the extreme example being, some person, whether a toddler or a grown-up not paying attention, is wandering in front of a bus, and you quick pull them out of the road instead of waiting and trying to talk them into it. You force them. Is that okay? And is it because, well, if they understood, then they would have been happy about that and consented to it? And again, it's just to get people to think about it and see where they draw lines. The 4th chunk has to do with fraud and deception. So 3 is about the use of force. Oh, including defensive force. So it's aggressive force and defensive force, and where do they draw the line, and when do they think it's justified? And again, it doesn't matter where they answer. They might all the way be pacifists and say, I don't ever believe force is justified. And I personally think that's sort of ridiculous and stupid and maybe even immoral, but the program isn't going to call them to task for it. It's just going to make note of it and, okay, well, that's your view of how things are, and move on. And later, when somebody says they're a pacifist, I never believe in using force, good luck justifying statism, which all it is force. Like, you can be an anarchist without being a pacifist, because that's me, you can't be an actual pacifist without being an anarchist. Because if you advocate government, you advocate violence. But it doesn't ever preach it. It doesn't explain it like that. It just asks them questions about it till they have to go, oh yeah, if I vote for somebody to force my neighbor, that's me voting for force. And plays into the whole thing of, is it okay for you to delegate to somebody else? Like, it's not okay for you to use force. Is it okay for you to ask somebody else or pay somebody else to do it for you? So then the fourth chunk has to do with fraud and deception, like depriving people of stuff by faking them out. The fifth chunk has to do with retaliation and punishment. Let's say somebody did something really bad. What would you feel justified in doing about it? And it uses different levels of badness. Like if somebody was all the way a serial killer, would you feel justified in using force to stop them? How about deadly force? What if they're not in the act right now? It's just a guy walking down the street, but you know that they did it. Would you feel justified? And it even gets into the whole thing of, how sure do you have to be that somebody did it? Like, you heard a rumor that somebody did something bad. Are you going to go beat the tar out of him? Or are you going to go, well, wait, I want to make sure I know for sure? And again, this is just collecting little bits and pieces of their view. Most of the questions are sort of throwaway questions, but there are some very crucial pieces that the program remembers that the person answered that way to paint an overall picture of how they view right and wrong. Number 6 has to do with property and ownership of things and trade and stuff. And again, you can all the way be a commie and believe in stuff that I think is idiotic, and the collective owns the means of production stuff I totally make fun of. The program isn't going to make fun of them. It's just going to accept their answers and move on and lead to the contradictions. And property and ownership gets into trade and homesteading and things like that. And then number 6 is fun because number 6 gets into, 7 opens out. So visually, this whole time, they're sort of going through a maze thing. They're going from room to room, and the different chunks have completely different visual sort of themes of what they look like. And depending on each answer, a thing opens in the wall, and you go into the next room, and so it looks really cool. Well, after that, the walls fall away. After you've gone through all the basics of your moral view on all these different things, the walls fall away, and you're on this huge island. And then it gets into the thing I've done before in person and in other ways with people, getting them to consider, all right, it's you and 100 strangers on a big island. And there's lots of natural resources, but you're it. There's no government, there's no 911, there's no authority. You were all just plunked there. You don't know the other people. What are you going to do about it? And starts going through scenarios. Would you be okay with this? Would you be okay with this? Do you think it's okay for the majority to say, well, we think we should focus on building a bonfire and we're going to force the minority to go along with it? Do you believe in that? Or do you think if the minority says, well, we think it's more important to, start finding water and food and stuff, are you going to let them do that? Or do you think the majority? And so it goes through a bunch of scenarios, including, all right, now somebody on the island sort of going berserk and beating up other people. What are we going to do about that? And so a lot of the island is basically testing the principles they laid down in the earlier parts to apply them to actual examples that could really happen in the real world and see what they say about it. And then eventually it expands the island to, we just found out about another island. And they just came over by boat. There's another island over there, and it has 1,000 people on it. How would you deal with that? Like, how does that, have an effect on your belief in morality and right and wrong, or does it? And, maybe it's an island of scary, violent people that are going to attack. Okay, now what do we do? So none of the questions are ever open-ended, like, now what do you do? It's always yes or no. It's always multiple choice, because now what do you do? You can't, there's not a way to process that, really. And then after the island, and they've given their answers to all the scenarios and given their answers to all the general things, then it applies it to, now we met this other island, we met the other island, now we met the rest of the world. We have a way off the island to the rest of the world where there are governments and there are laws and there are authority. How do all your views of what you answered up to here apply in a world, basically in the world we all live in now, including in the country you're in, or in other times, in other places? And that's at the point at which it brings back their answers from all those questions and applies them to their belief in government, and they don't ever match. They can't. It's impossible to have general questions to any question of morality and have them actually match a belief in statism without being hypocritical and paradoxical and all sorts of weird things. So that's how it gets to that. Anyway, that's a very brief overview. Every one of these chunks has a bunch of questions and different like individual items it covers, and then the whole flow chart of where everything goes. So I'm not getting into all that, but that gives you sort of a huge, what's it called, 1,000-foot overview of the main chunks of the thing. And then at the end, what it does is just leave them with their answers and with their contradictions, if there are them. And it doesn't say, ha, you contradicted yourself. It just gets to the point of, okay, here it breaks down. Here's what you believe. You said this and this and this. If they get to the point where they actually have no contradictions, there's sort of an ending, a little thing that it shows after all of their answers have told them, have aimed them in the direction of voluntarism. Otherwise, it just leaves them there to think about their stuff and like, here's what you believe, here's what you said, here are possible problems or conflicts or contradictions. So now that it's like freaking pitch black out here, well, not really, but my camera's having trouble recording this. So I'm going to shut up now, but that's a quick overview of the main chunks of what the mirror goes through. And then as I'm working on different pieces of it, I'll give updates. So most of the updates, I'm going to post this one publicly, but most of the updates are only to people who actually support the thing on Patreon. So I'm going to stick a link below for people who want to become supporters of the mirror. And again, it's many, many months off. It's a huge program. It's a huge project. Biggest thing I've ever done by a mile. But still working on it, and I'm making these updates so people know I'm still working on it, because I don't want to just be silent for another year and people have no freaking idea what I'm doing. So, all right, now that you can just barely see me, see y'all later.